Okay, so welcome back to part 5 of this guided tour of Foucault's History of Sexuality. We will be going over the chapters entitled Method and Domain. So we begin with the chapter named Domain, and right away we get this massive list of what power is not. And these first few pages, 92 through 95, they're particularly famous. Tons of quotes come from here. Like when he says we were always inside of power, meaning that there is no outside of power. So it sounds a little depressing, it sounds a little suffocating, particularly if you're a fan of the concept agency. Personally, I don't really care for this word because people can never define what it means to me. It's this massive mythical concept, kind of like freedom. What is that? How do you define it? Where are its boundaries and limitations? Agency in Foucault doesn't really work because if one acquires something called agency or something that looks like agency, very likely you're positioned or positioned yourself over somebody else. So somebody automatically falls beneath you. So does that mean agency is the power to exploit someone else somewhere else? I don't know. Maybe. But continuing, why describe power in terms of what it is not? Well, for sure, it's so that we can't reify what power is, even though people try to. This is obviously a technique to attempt to prevent that. But something really interesting happens in this discursive technique, mainly that we lose sight of a primary subject or a centralized node of power. So what do I mean by subject? Now, there are a couple ways to interpret that, and I'll give you one. So in Marx, you have a bad guy. You have the capitalist. He is the one that you fight against. He is the powerful subject that exploits the working class subject below him. Now, with Foucault, we have no such figures, as power is located in the relationship and the friction between. So, like Foucault says, power is not acquired, seized, or shared, but exercised from innumerable points and mobile relations. That's on page 94. Additionally, power comes from below, which is another very famous quote. So, to use a kind of overused example, so if we look at someone like Hitler, who looks like this total centralized power figure, this still does not explain how so many individuals, including, for example, elite Jewish people, became complicit in the bureaucratic machinery that became the Holocaust. It's very easy to claim Hitler did it, but that does not explain all the power mechanisms that happened below, including the very slow dismantling and decimation of the Jewish psyche, which led millions of people to willingly kill themselves. Now, there were many mechanisms and a larger system of power relations, at work here. This is what Foucault might call technologies of power. That is, vast, cumulative, comprehensive systems of power. Now, on the issue of resistance, which is another very popular concept. So on page 95, he said, where there is power, there is resistance. Yet this resistance is just as varied as power. So there's a plurality of resistances that take many forms with many interests. This might explain why it's so difficult to start a movement under one banner. For example, a Marxist class movement in the United States might not work because there are different interests in different groups, like different, for example, racialized populations. And maybe they hierarchize things that are important to life in different ways, along with a differential access to, let's say, knowledge and education. So, power instead might be organized in many local centers from below. Local centers is a Foucault word. This is quite the opposite of thinking of power in this typical juridical top-down mode. So with Foucault, it can be top-down. It can also be bottom-up. It can even be horizontal. And on the last page of the chapter entitled Method, he suggests that we start formulating a strategical model of power. And then right away in the next chapter called Domain, he says there is no single all-encompassing strategy. So he goes on to 4 different strategies. So there's the sexualization of children, the hystericization of women, the categorization of perverts and perversions, and new regulations designed to control populations. Now, these are all different strategies of power and knowledge production. Somehow, these seemingly separate technologies came together and constructed what we know of as sexuality. So sexuality itself is a construct, a discursive construct. Yet we can't really tell who constructed the concept because there is no single author. But it all comes together and it appears to be an overall strategy, yet it lacks a mastermind. So there is no single subject or single institution that's responsible for all of these things coming together. And when we really, really think about it, there would be no way to coordinate such a master plan. How could we have known this very special combination of X, Y, and Z would lead to situations A, B, and C? It'd be very difficult to try to predict something like that. So, up next, we have the chapter entitled Periodization, which is like a mini genealogy within this larger genealogy. So I'll spend some time talking about the difference between Foucauldian archaeology and genealogy. And I will see you guys in the next video very soon.